The room was smaller than it should have been for a woman whose image filled theaters across the world, a narrow space tucked behind layers of soundproofing and false walls, designed not for comfort but for containment. The recording equipment hummed softly, a low mechanical breath that filled the silence with expectation. Marilyn Monroe sat alone beneath a single overhead light, its glow unforgiving, flattening glamour into something raw and unadorned. The mirror on the far wall had been removed at her request. She did not want to see herself reflected back through glass that had never told her the truth. Outside the room, the studio slept, its corridors empty, its power temporarily dormant, but she knew it would wake again soon, hungry and relentless. This was the hour she had chosen because it belonged to no one else. She adjusted the microphone with careful hands, fingers steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest. This was not a performance. There were no cameras, no audience, no applause waiting at the end. There was only the machine ready to capture everything she had never been allowed to say. The confession was not born of impulse but of accumulation, years of swallowed words compacted into something dense and dangerous. She had learned long ago that silence was expected of her, that compliance was rewarded, and that resistance was quietly punished. Tonight, she intended to reverse that equation. The tape began to spin, its quiet rotation marking the point of no return. Marilyn leaned forward, her face half lost in shadow, the light carving sharp contrasts where softness had once been demanded. She spoke into the void not as an icon, but as a witness to her own life, tracing the contours of a system that had shaped her, consumed her, and attempted to erase the person beneath the persona. The confession unfolded methodically, each revelation placed with intention, not for shock but for clarity. She spoke of contracts that owned more than her time, of rooms where decisions were made about her body and mind without her consent, of smiles demanded on days when standing upright felt like a victory. She detailed the quiet coercion disguised as concern, the medical authority wielded as a leash, the way vulnerability was harvested and sold back to her as necessity. The tape absorbed it all without judgment, a neutral witness to truths that had never been permitted daylight. As the hours passed, the room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavier with each admission. Marilyn's voice never rose, never cracked into hysteria. It remained measured, controlled, as if she were documenting evidence rather than unburdening a soul. That restraint was deliberate. She wanted this record to survive scrutiny, to stand unassailable when the world eventually heard it. She knew they would question her sanity, her motives, her credibility. She had lived long enough inside the machine to anticipate every counterattack. When the confession turned inward, it did so without mercy. She spoke of complicity, of moments when fear outweighed courage, when survival required silence. She did not absolve herself. She contextualized. The tape became not just an indictment of Hollywood, but a map of how power reshapes those trapped within it. Somewhere beyond the walls, dawn began to hint at its arrival, but inside the room time had lost its authority. Marilyn continued, her words forming a narrative that refused to flatten her into victim or myth. She framed herself as a participant in a system that demanded her fragmentation, a woman who learned to split herself into manageable pieces to endure. When the final reel approached its end, she outlined her intent with calm precision. This recording was not meant for immediate release. It was insurance, a message sealed against erasure. Instructions were documented elsewhere, safeguards arranged with the same discretion that had governed the recording itself. The confession was designed to surface only after her voice could no longer be interrupted, when her absence would deny them the opportunity to discredit her through proximity. As the tape clicked to a stop, Marilyn remained seated, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes unfocused. There was no relief, only a quiet, steady certainty that something irreversible had been set in motion. She carefully labeled the reels, each marked with an innocuous code that concealed their significance. The machine powered down, plunging the room into a deeper silence than before. She gathered the tapes and placed them into a plain case, its anonymity intentional. When she finally stood, her movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. She extinguished the light and stepped back into the sleeping studio, carrying with her a truth too volatile to be trusted to the present. In the days that followed, the confession was hidden, transferred between secure locations known only to a select few, its existence whispered but never confirmed. Marilyn returned to her public life seamlessly, the mask settling back into place with practiced ease. Yet beneath every appearance, every smile, the knowledge persisted that her real voice had been captured somewhere beyond reach, waiting. The studio sensed a shift it could not name, an undercurrent of defiance that unsettled its routines. Meetings grew tense. Surveillance tightened. Marilyn noticed the change and said nothing. She understood that the most dangerous truths are those that remain silent, gathering power in the dark. What she could not foresee was how quickly silence could be enforced, how efficiently evidence could be erased. The confession existed now, but its future was uncertain, suspended between revelation and disappearance, its fate entwined with forces far larger than any single woman, no matter how luminous her image had been. The existence of the confession altered the gravitational field around her life, invisible yet undeniable, bending every interaction and decision toward its hidden weight. Marilyn moved through sets and meetings with the same outward compliance, but her awareness sharpened, attuned to subtle shifts in tone and timing. She noticed how doors closed more softly now, how conversations paused when she entered, how concern replaced familiarity in the eyes of those who once spoke freely around her. The studio's machinery had sensed a deviation, a variable it could not quantify, and it responded as it always did, by tightening control under the guise of protection. Schedules were adjusted without explanation, appointments added and cancelled with abrupt efficiency, medical evaluations suggested with renewed urgency. Marilyn accepted these intrusions with studied calm, understanding that resistance would only accelerate scrutiny. Instead, she observed, cataloguing patterns, confirming suspicions she had already documented on tape. The confession was no longer just a record of the past. It was a living threat to a system that thrived on managed narratives. Somewhere within the studio hierarchy, questions were being asked quietly, their answers sought through channels designed to leave no trace. Marilyn felt the perimeter closing, not through overt confrontation, but through the slow erosion of privacy. Her phone calls crackled with faint delays, her movements tracked with newfound interest, her relationships subtly strained by planted doubts. She responded by becoming smaller in public and more deliberate in private, reducing her footprint while reinforcing the safeguards she had set in motion. The tapes changed hands according to pre-arranged protocols, never staying long enough in one place to become vulnerable, their locations known only through layered intermediaries who understood the cost of betrayal. Marilyn trusted few, but she trusted process, having built redundancy into every step. Yet even the most careful designs could not fully account for institutional paranoia. The studio's concern hardened into suspicion, then into quiet resolve. They had lost control of her once before through fame, and they would not allow it to happen again through truth. Marilyn sensed the shift when invitations ceased and demands replaced them, when caretaking language gave way to directives. She was reminded that her image was a commodity whose stability required oversight, that deviation could be framed as instability, that narratives could be rewritten with sufficient authority. She listened without argument, her silence misinterpreted as acquiescence. In reality, it was calculation. She knew that the confession's power lay not only in its content, but in its timing. Premature exposure would invite dissection and dismissal. Delay would allow it to surface into a vacuum they could not fill. As weeks passed, pressure mounted. Marilyn's access narrowed, her autonomy chipped away through procedural justifications. She was advised to rest, to withdraw, to allow others to manage her affairs. Each suggestion carried an implied warning, a reminder of who held leverage. She complied selectively, choosing battles that preserved energy rather than visibility. The confession waited, inert yet potent, a dormant charge wired to detonate in absence. At night, Marilyn revisited its contents in memory, testing them against her present reality, confirming their accuracy. She felt no regret. If anything, the tightening net affirmed the necessity of what she had done. Truth, she realized, provokes reaction even when unseen. The studio began its own quiet investigation, searching for anomalies, tracing deviations, interrogating the margins of her life where secrets might hide. Files were reviewed, confidants evaluated, routines dissected. Marilyn watched from within, her composure unbroken, her awareness acute. She understood that disappearance was not always sudden. Sometimes it unfolded as a series of erasures, each justified as care. The first safeguard failed without announcement, a contact going silent, a scheduled transfer missed. Marilyn adjusted, activating contingencies, but the pattern unsettled her. The system was adapting faster than anticipated, learning the shape of her defenses through attrition. She responded by accelerating timelines where possible, compressing windows of vulnerability, ensuring that no single point of failure could collapse the entire structure. Still, the sense of impending intervention grew. The studio's concern crystallized into resolve. They did not need to know the confession's full contents to fear it. Its mere existence threatened the equilibrium they depended on. Marilyn felt the weight of inevitability settle in, not as panic but as clarity. She had always known this path narrowed toward confrontation, whether direct or indirect. The confession was designed to outlive her precisely, because survival within the system was never guaranteed. As the days shortened, Marilyn's public appearances took on a valedictory quality she alone perceived. She observed the world with heightened attentiveness, committing textures and details to memory, aware that continuity was no longer assured. The tapes remained hidden, but their safety was no longer absolute. Forces beyond her control were moving, efficient and impersonal, toward containment. Marilyn did not retreat. She maintained her routines, her compliance, her silence, understanding that the most dangerous moment for truth is when it is almost free. The confession waited, balanced on the edge between revelation and erasure, its fate bound to decisions being made in rooms she would never enter, by hands that believed control was synonymous with order. The final phase did not announce itself with drama or confrontation, but with a tightening quiet that settled over everything she touched, a silence so deliberate it felt engineered. Marilyn sensed it in the way access evaporated without explanation, in how familiar corridors became monitored spaces, in the sudden efficiency with which decisions about her life were made elsewhere, and delivered as conclusions rather than options. The system had completed its assessment, and reached the only outcome it ever allowed when uncertainty threatened its authority. Containment replaced observation. The confession, still unseen and unheard, had already altered the balance of power simply by existing, and that was enough to justify neutralization. Marilyn continued to move through her days with measured calm, aware that overt resistance would only validate the narrative being prepared around her. She understood the mechanics intimately now, how concern could be weaponized, how isolation could be framed as care, how disappearance could be made to look like inevitability. The safeguards she had constructed began to collapse one by one, not through dramatic breaches but through administrative precision. Records were misplaced, intermediaries delayed, storage locations rendered inaccessible under benign pretexts. Each failure was deniable, each delay plausibly accidental, yet together they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Marilyn adjusted again, but the margin for adaptation narrowed rapidly. The confession's timeline compressed against forces that operated without patience. She realized that the final protection she had built into the plan was no longer procedural, but temporal. The recording was designed to surface after her death, but it required survival long enough to ensure the mechanism remained intact. As that assumption weakened, the confession's fate became precarious. Marilyn experienced this not as fear but as a profound stillness, a recognition that the struggle had moved beyond her capacity to influence directly. She had already done the essential work. The truth existed. That fact could not be undone, only obscured. In the days that followed, her world contracted further, reduced to controlled environments where unpredictability was minimized. Observation replaced collaboration. Marilyn felt herself being studied not as a person but as a variable, her moods charted, her routines optimized for compliance. She offered them nothing they could seize upon, maintaining a surface of stability that denied easy justification for escalation. Internally, she prepared for absence, organizing her thoughts around the possibility that she would not witness the confession's release. This preparation was not resignation, but acceptance of scale. The forces aligned against her were institutional, systemic, indifferent to individual intent. Her role had been to introduce disruption. What followed belonged to momentum. The night the confession disappeared did not arrive with violence or chaos. It unfolded quietly, with the same administrative thoroughness that characterized everything else. One of the final storage points was accessed under routine authorization, its contents logged, transferred, and lost within layers of custody, designed to diffuse responsibility. By morning, the tapes no longer occupied any official space. Their absence registered as an anomaly briefly, then was absorbed into the noise of daily operations. Marilyn sensed the loss before it was confirmed, a subtle shift as though a pressure she had grown accustomed to suddenly released. The confession, at least in its physical form, was gone. What remained was uncertainty. Had copies survived, had redundancy held, or had the system finally succeeded in erasing the evidence entirely? Marilyn did not receive answers. Instead, she felt the consequences ripple outward, the studio's posture relaxing, surveillance easing, concern giving way to closure. The threat had been neutralized, or so they believed. In this lull, Marilyn understood the final irony. Even erased, the confession had already fulfilled part of its purpose. It had forced reaction, exposed fear, revealed the lengths to which power would go to protect itself. Those reactions left traces that could not be fully scrubbed, impressions carried by individuals who had glimpsed the edges of something dangerous and real. Marilyn carried those impressions too, internalized as clarity rather than bitterness. She moved through her remaining days with a heightened awareness of impermanence, not only her own but that of narratives imposed upon her. She recognized that control depended on silence, and silence depended on belief. Somewhere, whether in memory, in partial copies, or in the altered trajectories of those who had intersected with it, the confession persisted as an idea if not an artifact. Marilyn's life narrowed toward its end under circumstances that would later invite speculation, analysis, and myth. The absence of the confession ensured that interpretation would dominate over evidence, that mystery would eclipse accountability. Yet even in disappearance, the confession exerted influence. It shaped how questions were asked, how doubts lingered, how certainty fractured. Marilyn did not live to see any resolution, but resolution had never been her objective. She had sought to assert authorship over her own story, to leave behind a record that resisted simplification. Though the tapes vanished, the act of recording them remained an assertion of agency that could not be retroactively revoked. In the quiet aftermath, as her image hardened into legend and her humanity softened into abstraction, the unreleased confession became part of the negative space surrounding her life, defined by its absence rather than its content. That absence invited inquiry, unsettled complacency, and refused closure. The system achieved silence, but not peace. Marilyn's voice, though unheard, continued to resonate through the questions it provoked, the unease it left behind, and the recognition that even the most meticulously managed narratives are vulnerable to disruption. The confession was gone, but its shadow endured, a reminder that truth does not require an audience to exist, only the courage to be spoken once, somewhere beyond reach.